You put your hand up, and then it goes round the cube and in the end everybody's quiet.
Oh right, oh no, it's in regular use.
Hey Rob. Okay, welcome everybody. I'm Rob Hopkins, and I'm going to talk about a book that I written that's coming out in October about imagination, called From What Is to What If. And I want to start with the quote that the book starts with by Susan Griffin. She said, "One might say that human societies have two boundaries. One boundary is drawn by the requirements of the natural world, and the other by the collective imagination." And the first thing that I would like to do requires you getting into a pair with somebody, ideally who you didn't know before you came. So just have a little look around and find somebody who might be your partner for the next couple of minutes. It's not a lifetime commitment, it's just for 2 minutes. Okay? Everybody got a partner? Good. Okay. So what I'm going to ask you to do with your partner, by the way, I always do this thing when I do talks all over the place, get into a partner with somebody you didn't know before you came. So far I've had 3 couples come up to me and say, you know that thing you do where you say to meet somebody, meet my partner, and has been 1 baby come out of it, at least to my knowledge, so be careful. So you're at Klein and Bill McKibben kept saying things like climate change is a failure of the imagination. And David, what's he called? I wrote it down. David Wells, the guy who wrote The Uninhabitable Earth, he said, in relation to climate change, we suffer from an incredible failure of the imagination. So I kept reading all these people saying this, but then I didn't read many people who were saying, why are we having a failure of the imagination? What's that all about? Why in 2019 would we be in a time when we're faced with a challenge where the IPCC say we need to see rapid, urgent and far-reaching changes to all aspects of society? We don't go, great! Fantastic, we'll put that over there and we'll move that around and we'll change that, but we tend to go, oh. So it set me off on this exploration of saying, are we living in a time where actually we need our imagination to be at its strongest, but actually we're living in a kind of a time of imaginative poverty, and actually our imagination is under a fairly unprecedented perfect storm of challenges. And I read some really interesting research done in 2011 by a researcher in the US who looked at this thing called the Torrance test for creative thinking. That's a creativity test that looks at divergent thinking, that ability to make new connections and assemblies of different things. And her conclusion was that imagination and IQ rose together till the mid-90s, and then they parted. IQ kept rising, imagination went into what she called a steady and persistent decline. And this was published, it was a big story in the US, it was on the front page of Newsweek magazine, and there was a whole lot of soul searching in the US. What does this mean for economic growth? Like, who cares? What does this mean for Hollywood and Pixar? Again, who cares, really? But I never heard anyone in the social justice, climate change world say, what does this mean for us? Because fundamentally what we're trying to do is to help people to imagine a different world. One of the main things I had when I did my permaculture design course was it completely overhauled my imagination of walking around, seeing possibilities. Streets are no longer just a street, they're a place where that could happen and that could happen and that could climb up there and that could grow around there. So it set me off on this process, which I want to share with you. And what came out of it were 9 what-if questions. So hopefully by the end of this session you might agree with me that I think what if are the 2 most powerful words in our language in 2019. And so you might think of this next 45 minutes or so as a kind of a love poem to those 2 words, what if. And it comes in the form of 9 questions. And the first one is, what if we took play seriously? So one of the things that the researcher in the US, she attributed this decline to a few different things. One of them was the decline of kind of free, unstructured play in society. You know, 30, 40 years ago, most kids grew up spending a lot of time playing in the street. They had a whole culture of games and activities and songs and places that adults knew nothing about. And that's kind of in many places been replaced by this idea of kids starting to put their CV together from the age of 4 and being constantly ferried around from thing to thing, and we've lost that sort of sense of just being out and playing. And it's so important because that's where you learn to cooperate, it's where you learn to resolve conflict, it's where you learn to take risks. And if we have a generation of kids who don't take risks, we produce a generation of adults who don't take risks, which is the worst kind of adults to be producing at the moment. And increasingly play becomes something that you buy and that you consume rather than something that you do, which leads me on to my prop for the day, which is Hello Barbie. Now, Hello Barbie took a lot of tracking down. They're not around. So in 2015, Mattel launched Hello Barbie, and Hello Barbie, I carry around in my bag all the time. She's looking a bit bedraggled, but she took a little bit of tracking down. So Hello Barbie was the first smart Wi-Fi enabled doll that has conversations with your child from a 216-page script that Mattel have devised. And I actually got a copy of that script. And it has a couple of beautiful gems in it. One of which is that Barbie says, "So now that we've used our imagination and played games, let's get serious and talk about something really important, fashion." Isn't that great? And the one what you're seeing or what you're experiencing with your partner. Okay, I might just gently coax you back, if I might. You might just, however you might like to thank your partner that feels appropriate, please do that. Okay. So, thank you for going on that imaginative journey. I wonder if anybody feels they'd like to share, not necessarily what they saw or felt or whatever, but how that was as an exercise, how that felt to do.
I thought it was really uplifting. Yeah.
At the back? Calming. Thank you. Any more? Grounding. Thank you.
I didn't expect it to be so emotional, Ron.
Yeah.
Suddenly emotional.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. exciting.
It tested the imagination.
Good, great, thank you. Yep.
There's something quite unifying about doing the time travel sound together as well.
Yeah.
It actually feels as though we're looking at
Yeah. Yeah, you know, I did, yeah?
With my partner, we came up with a very similar idea of what we wanted, down to quite intimate detail.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
So it's really reassuring that whoever you speak to, whoever does this exercise, we have a similar dream.
Yeah,
Why aren't we making it happen?
Yeah.
Because everywhere in the world we have such a similar dream. It's beautiful.
and the thing that's really interesting, whenever I do this with very different groups, is the first thing people always say is birdsong. Yeah.
I felt a sense of freedom and joy describing what it could be.
Great, thank you. At the back? Yeah, are you just stretching? You're kind of... Hand up, yeah.
I just thought it looked really nice and peaceful, and we weren't using any fossil fuels anymore.
Great, thank you.
I noticed that the things that I could hear going on around me, people were not talking about technological advancements. They weren't talking about rockets going off, or they were just talking about people enjoying leisure, enjoying just like enjoying being.
Thank you. Yeah.
But perhaps it's easier to engage with somebody else's imagination with your eyes shut, because
Yeah.
you're not actually looking at them, you haven't got all this other visual stimuli.
And it's kind of safer, I think, as well. Somehow. Yeah. So I did this exercise in France with a group of people who had spent years working as climate change activists, and the woman said to me afterwards, I've spent 20 years working as a climate activist, and I realise I've never done anything like this. So I'm campaigning for something that I can't imagine. I've not imagined. She said, this should be like a daily practice. And it feels to me like there's something really powerful about doing it. So if you do this exercise with people and you say to go 90 years forward into the future, it brings up a huge amount of kind of despair and fear, and I don't know that there'll be anything in 90 years, and what will, but actually 11 years, when you frame it in the context, it feels sometimes, I'm an enormous admirer of Extinction Rebellion. My wife is in court in 2 weeks because from being arrested 3 times. She's a serial arrestee, and but it feels to me like when a lot of the language focuses on we're fucked and despair and all that kind of thing, that we also need to be keeping the space open for the possibility that actually what we see over the next 11 years is utterly phenomenal and extraordinary shifting and transformation. Otherwise we end up designing into our DNA a sense that we're probably not going to do it, which really doesn't feel very helpful. So we'll have time for questions afterwards, if that's okay.
I don't know, there's just the possibilities are limited by the lack of imagination.
Yeah. We need a revolution of the imagination. This is, yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to give you a few more what-if questions. So what if we followed nature's lead? What if actually nature was we really cherished the role that nature plays in terms of reboosting our imagination? As part of the research for this, I went and did a dawn chorus walk. I thought, I'm never going to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning, and then I read an article by Henry Porter who said it's really easy to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning. You just drink loads of water the night before you go to bed, which worked really well. So and it was just amazing going to the best concert you've ever been to in your life, and afterwards for months I felt so much more connected and sort of hearing birdsong wherever I went. I read a woman called, I don't know if it's a man or a woman actually, René Dubos, who was a microbiologist, who used to say, if we lived on the moon, our imagination would be as barren as the moon. And I think when we're living in a time where we're seeing the collapse of biodiversity, and we've lost, in my lifetime, 70% of the creatures we share this planet with, that we could get into a state of what some people call pre-traumatic stress disorder, this kind of where we know that's going on, and it's another feed of cortisol that is shrinking our imagination, our sense of possibilities, as we see that contraction of the natural world around us. And I spoke to one of my heroes, one of my sheroes from America, a woman called Daria Robinson, runs a project called Urban Tilth in Richmond, California, a very poor neighborhood there, lots of guns and gangs, and she's been working there for years, 15 years, teaching young people how to grow food. And I said, how have you seen the community change? So you've got like a generation of young people you've now taken through, connecting them with the soil and plants and the seasons and stuff. And she said that when she grew up here, everybody's thing was, we've got to get out of here because if we stay here, we're going to die here. She said, now I hear a lot of people saying, I want to live here. I want to be able to afford to buy a house here and make my life here. And they're dreaming out all kinds of other new things and feeling like it's totally within the realm of possibility. They can be their own community developers. They can start these different businesses. There's a lot more people getting involved in politics. There's a lot more people with imaginative ideas. They want to start things like new non-profits and other things starting up. So making space for nature, I don't need to tell you lot that, you're at a permaculture conference. Anyway, what if, this is quite a big one for me because this was not my experience at all. What if school nurtured young imaginations? What if we had an education system where you left with your imagination feeling honed like a superpower and where anything felt possible? And there's a fascinating thing I found out about in Italy called Reggio Emilia, which is a model of education which has inspired many of the most imaginative schools around the world. And in 1945, when the Germans retreated, they were left with 1 tank, 3 trucks and 6 horses. And they sold them with this idea of how can we create a system of education that can ensure that fascism never happens again. And they talk about... too many bits of paper. They talk about seeing young people as beautiful, powerful, competent, creative, curious, and full of potential and ambitious desires, and authors of their own learning. I don't think any school I ever went to looked at me like that, I have to say. School in Plymouth, which started recently, where the Plymouth Art College was noting that all these kids were arriving at 16 to go to art college and were saying, this is the first creative thing we've done. We've spent the last 12 years passing tests and trying to guess what's in our teachers' heads, and this is the first space we've had in which to be creative. So the guy who ran the art college said, well, why we should make a school that's like an art school, that goes from 4 to 16 and is designed like an art college. So their brief to the architects to design this school was no corridors, no room that resembles a cell for 30 inmates, specialist performance studio space and studio spaces. We want it totally accessible to an inner city neighbourhood. And initially they'd wanted to do it in an old department store. So they said, given that we can't have the department store, build us a department store that we can occupy as a school. Fantastic. And an amazing place. And really, like, all the classrooms are like studios in an art college. You know, there's no rows of desks, none of that nonsense. Actually, he draws the future in ways that feel like places that we already recognise. And what he does is he goes out into Leeds and he takes places that already exist and he sits there and he draws them. And then he stops people as they walk past and says, what should this place be like in the future? And then draws those in. He says, all you need is a really simple sketch to unlock people's imagination and sense of what's possible. This is what would Leeds look like. invite so many people to step in and say, we've got a bit of that. And also that it says if everybody in London made 1 square metre into green or blue space, that would achieve the bit that's needed. And it's such a beautiful invitation. They did a lovely thing on social media where they asked people to send in their what if national park city questions. And they were things like, what if in London you couldn't hear the cars because the bird song was so loud? What if you could swim in all the canals? What if there were more trees than people in London? But all the way through they framed it around what if questions, and it's absolutely beautiful. Right, now I need, for this next bit, I need 2 volunteers from the audience, please. I don't bite, so it's okay. Are there 2 people who might like to come up, yeah? Very good. Now, I'm going to give you this. And I'm going to give you this. So, again, we're in 2030. I'd like you to imagine that in 2030, the UK has actually achieved net zero, and you are here at a fundamentally fascinating historic moment. So in 2030, the Chancellors of the Exchequer, because by then it's a job share, because most people work a 3-day week, so the Chancellor of the Exchequer is a shared role, are standing up to give the autumn statement in 2030. And by 2030, we no longer measure progress in terms of economic growth, we measure it in terms of a whole wide range of things. So this is the moment when they are standing up in the House of Commons to announce that the UK has achieved zero carbon. So you need to be really excited about this, okay? You need to be making a bit of noise here.
Okay. It gives us great pleasure as Chancellors of the Exchequer to deliver this autumn statement for 2030. It's now 5 years since His Majesty's government began using a far wider measurements and indicators of progress than economic growth, as was previously the case. This budget is a celebration of the remarkable national effort that we have seen over the past 10 years.
The headline for the statement is that, according to the latest figures from the Climate Change Committee, the UK has achieved its target of net zero carbon emissions. Please. This is an historic achievement, and it is a source of enormous pride for me to be able to make that announcement. I can announce that 97.4% of the UK's energy now comes from renewable sources. And due to the widespread conservation measures, we now use 55% less energy than we used 10 years ago. I would like to acknowledge the role of the UK's former oil and gas sector, which, in 2022, reimagined themselves as 100% renewable energy companies and invested all of their resources, financial and organisations, to achieve that, decarbonising within 5 years.
I can also announce that this year we will reach our target of 85% of the nation's homes having been retrofitted to a high insulation standards. A nationwide push which has created over 2 million skilled jobs. 2030 is now the 7th year that the UK has had free public transport. A radical move imposed by the Climate Emergency Coalition government that has been adopted by 56 other nations around the world. This has had a huge impact
We commend this to the House. That was a practice. We commend this statement to the House.
Have you sent that on to the current council?
Thank you. That was beautiful. Yeah, and so my last two ones of these are: what if this is an even bigger struggle in the UK in 2019, right? What if our leaders prioritised the cultivation of imagination? What if we elected the governments who led to the creation of a National Imagination Act, which enshrined the right to imagine for all citizens, which put all legislation through the lens of, does this increase the conditions for people to be imaginative, or does it make them decline? In which case, actually, austerity wouldn't be allowed, because it would be ruinous to a nation's imagination. I started looking around to find out, are there actually places where local or city governments are seriously looking at imagination? In Mexico City, the mayor of Mexico City in his office has basically what is a Ministry of Imagination in his office, which sounds like something out of a Harry Potter book. But they actually have it in Mexico. And the woman who runs that, whose name is Gabriela Gomez Montt, she said, imagination is not a luxury. We should not be thinking about building cities for the human. We should not only